always worry slightly that because we're moving so quickly in terms of changes to the technologies and the platform, and there's a new framework, I worry that people don't get a chance to invest the time it takes to learn their tools. They know they carry the risk, and maybe it's a human being problem, but it is interesting. There's so many legacy systems out there. It's often disaster that actually convinces people that now they have to do something. In the past, if I wanted to do an AKS cluster or I wanted to build a solution, I would go and search for information and get answers, through YouTube, through Google search, or whatever the case may be. And then I would spend my horsepower converting what I learned into the context of what I'm building. But I find with some of the AI and the built-in copilots that are surfacing even in all the developer tools, it's the other way around now.
Podcast by SundayPyjamas.
Well, first of all, Robert, I am very excited to have this conversation with you. We had I would say a 20-minute discussion at the Microsoft office about everything from adoption inside of Microsoft. We talked about leveraging AI. We talked about also Kubernetes, which was a fun chat. So welcome to our podcast. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Could you share a brief about, your time at Microsoft, how you look at it? What are you still learning today at Microsoft after, I think, 26 years now?
Yeah, so it has been a 26-year journey at Microsoft. I started back in 1998, probably before you were born, might be
I
my
was born in
guess.
96.
So a long time. I've actually spent my entire career in our consulting services organization. It used to be known as Microsoft Consulting Services. It's now called Industry Solutions Delivery. And over the 26 years, I've been focused on application development pretty much the whole time, software architecture, system integration, the whole gambit, as it were. But in the past few years, with the rise of AI, it's created a whole set of new types of learning and experiences. And as a kind of, I'll call it classical software developer, I was pretty good at my trade. 26 years gives you a lot of practice, plus years I spent working for other companies as well. The AI kind of created this whole new paradigm for programming where English became the new programming language, where we started to think more about what we could do around dynamic business logic. And it unearthed a whole bunch of new integration scenarios we might have been a little fearful to try to implement in the past are now things that we're kind of, just diving head over heels on. And that journey has meant that for myself and others like me, I feel like I represent probably a fairly large, maybe mature software development group of people. We had to spend some time relearning things, and understanding and really rethinking and reframing how we approach problems. And it's been an interesting journey. I feel I'm still on this journey, as other things about AI are kind of, I use the word discovered. And so people are constantly making interesting discoveries with AI and things that we'd never thought about. I'm kind of along for the journey like many others.
You mentioned that the approaches are evolving because of this new tool that we have called AI, and the new programming language is English. What kind
Yeah.
of implication does that have on delivering solution and solving problems for customers from what you are noticing right now?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me was, as software developers, we always looked for structure. We always wanted to build an interface to collect data such that the data could be represented in machines so that we could solve problems and we could apply algorithms and data structures and various other things. And with the rise of AI, the idea that we could provide an experience that is based on perhaps speech or based on spoken word, perhaps we were slightly fearful of that. And then being able to find really excellent techniques for turning I'll call it the natural communication world into a world that we could build software around. And then equally, we spend a lot of time building systems to present data in a very structured, and nice orderly kind of computer format. And now we have the ability to express the answers or the data or the outcome for whatever our business solution does in that same kind of human communication. It's a very interesting paradigm shift, and I think that we've moved away from trying to build systems that are very perhaps kind of PC centric or desktops, laptop centric, and we built mobile centric to now kind of communication based devices where it's the human. We're trying to get computers to talk to humans the way humans talk. And with these technologies, we can now do these things that were quite difficult to do in the past. So I find it intriguing. I think also the scenarios that people are exploring with AI are things I would never in a million years have imagined. Having AIs. I'll just pick a simple example. During doing search optimization, publishing, taking an article and then publishing blogs and other articles about other articles to kind of increase the number of links to articles to kind of influence search engines. Like these are things that I would never have dreamed about. It's fascinating what some people are doing.
There is a huge, you mentioned that as developers of application, we care deeply about structure. And I also feel there is one more thing that we deeply care about is how productive we are when we are developing applications.
Hmm.
I would term this era, the last 2 3 years, as like the phase one of the AI tooling that is coming out there, and everyone is taking what is out there and trying to build, I would say, technologies at various layers of the stack. So there are tools to research, there are tools to generate code, there are tools to test the code. So we are
Hmm.
applying these tools at every layer of the stack. How do you and, for example, your team think about developer productivity with these AI tools? Have you noticed like a significant shift, not in terms of numbers but also in terms of thinking? For example, before we would predict or estimate a project to take, for example, 12 months with a team of 20 developers. Now, is there like a fundamental shift in that planning stage because we kind of see that, oh, we have this tooling in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm first going to state that I think it probably has had less impact than I think we would ideally hope for. But the benefits that we have, I mean, with some of the embedded AI experiences, for example, GitHub Copilot, and I happen to work a lot in Visual Studio, and so some of the capabilities that I'll just say is now like IntelliSense on steroids, are wonderful. And I also find it very intriguing, particularly when I'm doing software development, that the the prediction of what the function should do and putting in the skeleton in the prototype, it it certainly acts as a bit of a productivity boost. The other thing I think I actually enjoy more from seeing that automatic code being put in when I start writing is it challenges the way I might have written the algorithm to begin with. So I often look at what's there and think, I'm not smart enough to have come up with that, or that is wrong. But the fact that I saw something made me challenge the way I would have built it. And so it's almost a little bit like peer programming hoped to be that we never quite accomplished. And so I kind of like the idea of the word copilot is a fantastic word. But it's almost like it's a peer programmer with me. It's like, oh, can I come up with a better algorithm than it came up with? Or did it think about an idea I hadn't done? But in terms of the overall project itself, we've been using kind of AI for generating everything from the requirements that go into a project. If you think about a team that's going to build some new solution, I tend to get brought in as a contractor to work with enterprise customers and government organizations, that kind of thing, to deliver on a project. But often there's a series of documents, there's requirements, there's meeting notes, there's a lot of material that's generated before projects are really kind of, people turn around and start writing code. And we're now using AI to actually say, hey, how can I take all these meeting notes and transcripts? Can the AI actually generate me a project in Azure DevOps or in GitHub, but fill out all the user stories, start putting in the tasks and the requirements? So we probably end up with a lot of productivity around the peripheral of the project. We end up with productivity, I think, writing code, although I'm going to argue a point that I think that probably the lines of code that I write, the input time is probably, I'm going to say, 5 to 10% of what I actually do and think about in programming or building a system. So although the AI is helping me out with the productivity of writing lines of code, I think when it comes to system design, understanding and listening to requirements, verifying kind of connectivity and protocols and secure design, there are areas that we are not really using AI kind of holistically for solution development. It tends to be kind of what's the best algorithm for sorting an array. I picked a simple thing, obviously, that we are focused on, but we haven't quite broadened that up to how could I build, an environment and perhaps even leverage existing environments within customer environments that comply to policies and processes and security and kind of configuration? How can we actually use an existing solution as input to help us generate another solution, based on, what an enterprise kind of has as part of their kind of structure when they do deployment. So there's an awful lot more that I think we can explore and do. I don't think AI is necessarily going to get better over the next year or two. People talk about peak AI, but I think that the creativity about how it's applied, we're in the infant mode. I think in that case.
We were having this conversation, I would say, in the last 2 3 weeks now, about how this tooling is kind of changing our personal workflow when it comes to developing application, and we were just trying to retrospect as to what do we actually do when we are using the tools, because we have been using it for quite some time now. And the one insight that we got is that previously, right before these tools were out there, education and implementation were very two different segments of activities,
Uh-huh.
whereas now they are getting intertwined more than previously. So for example, if you wanted to implement AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, previously you would want to make sure that you understand how everything works before even attempting to get started, whereas now there is this understanding that, oh, even if I get stuck, I will be able to debug it or troubleshoot it using AI, and hence you tend to educate yourself along the way also, rather than just do it before you even get started. Have you also kind of noticed that in your workflow as well?
Yes, and I'll say one more thing on that point, which is that in the past, if I wanted to do an AKS cluster or I wanted to build a solution, I would go and search for information and get answers, through YouTube, through Google search, or whatever the case may be. And then I would spend my horsepower converting what I'd learned into the context of what I'm building. But
Right.
I find with some of the AI and the built-in copilots that are surfacing even in all the developer tools, it's the other way around now. Now I'm starting with the context of what I'm trying to achieve, and the Copilot is pulling in the necessary knowledge and insights for what I'm actually trying to solve. Now that provides a productivity gain. There's no question about it. I always worry a little bit. Sometimes in the act of learning, it's nice to learn 5 things that you don't care about at the moment, because as a sort of a seasoned developer, those other 5 things that I learned about that aren't relevant often come back later in life as an important discovery. But yeah, the productivity gains for learning and the way in which we do things, as we say, is just quite different than we did before.
Right. So, you have worked as a solution architect. Could you describe what have you been working on? What is your workflow? What is the kind of approach that you take now that you have gotten burnt many times?
So I work lately for the past couple of years. I'm predominantly working in the public sector, and so I have Canadian federal customers, particularly in the Department of National Defense. And then I also have a number of customers and groups that I work with within the Ontario provincial government as well. There are some things I can't talk about, but there are lots of things I can talk about as well, for sure. In terms of the workflow, there's probably a desired state of how I'd like to work with some of the new AI and some of the new abilities. But because I do work in perhaps a fairly legacy organization, like governments, often, for example, things are still very waterfall in nature.
Right.
And I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but that's just sort of the reality of how it works. But when it comes to delivery, we're often able to do delivery and development work is very agile, even though the overall process itself tend to be fairly waterfall. In terms of my workflow process, with some of the AI tools, and I'll just pick a few examples. I used to spend a lot of time doing mock-ups and wireframing and that kind of thing. And I find, lots of decks, PowerPoint decks, and things like that. And often we would essentially start from a blank canvas. And so with Copilot now built into things like Word and built into PowerPoint, often I can do a very good job now of essentially prompting the system with very detailed kind of requirements, detailed sections I want to see, and I can sort of get from, let's say, 0% to 50% of a deck with just a good quality prompt, as it were, and then work to refine that. And so we use it a lot for scaffolding. Certainly, when it comes to building AI solutions, some of the scaffolding that it can generate for building solutions now, and things like Visual Studio, we can do. I'm hesitant to say that AI has revolutionized my own particular workflow, but I think it's more to do with the legacy and the scale of the organizations that I'm working with. But if I think for folks that are doing things that are more entrepreneurial in nature, you could take some, I don't want to say shortcuts, but you could take some fantastic direct paths to achieve an outcome so much faster than you were able to do before. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on.
So you're working with public sector right now, but
Yeah.
previously you worked with other industries as well.
Yeah, bigger industries, things like financial sector, insurance companies. I spent a lot of time doing telcos. With telcos, I used to be a IPTV architect for Bell Fibe, which used to be a Microsoft product, by the way, at one point before it was sold to Ericsson. So I worked a lot in the telco space. Worked with large retailers in kind of the .com days, and after, second and third waves of those as well. So, but all those years very much focused on solution architecture and software development, and some infrastructure that goes along with it. But yeah, public sector for probably the past, I'm going to say 3 to 4 years for sure.
So if you, retrospect on all these different industries and kind of share how they are different from a IT culture perspective. For example, if you go in finance, or if you mentioned that in the public sector, they use a lot of legacy softwares, still a lot of legacy systems in place. Whereas for, I'm assuming that if you're working with a fintech startup who is like very brand new, they might be trying to adhere to all the latest cutting edge stuff. Could you
Hmm.
maybe give us like a cultural overview of how these different sectors are from what you have been observing?
Yeah, the only thing I would challenge you on is it is weird that, and I'll just pick on the Ontario government for a moment. I actually put them fairly high up in terms
Right,
of their adoption of the latest and greatest in technologies, and I would say even their ability to say yes to, we're going to do something new and we're going to use all the cloud based technologies. It was actually a shock to me when I first started working with them. And again, Ontario government's a large organization with different people that are, at different stages. And that's probably the big thing, is that when we start working with a customer in these industries, we have to kind of meet them where they're at. And
right,
so Microsoft has technologies for sort of the legacy folks who want to do things the legacy way. And then for those that are more progressive, so in the Azure stack specifically, we'll meet them where they're at. If they're all open source and Linux and LAMP stack and Java and, a little bit old school, we have something for them. If they're .NET folks, we have something for them. If they want IaaS, or if they're interested in moving to sort of more PaaS-based solutions, or, as I know one of your favorite topics is AKS and the containerized kind of solutions as well. So they're all good. I think, trying to come back to your original question, it's tough because every customer is kind of at that different point in time, and they all have different areas of focus.
right.
For the financial institutions, security is paramount.
In all of them.
I would say financial sector specifically, security, even security without a reason why security would matter. Isolation is critical. Security, it's not just all about authentication and strong passwords. We're way beyond that. They want a level of network isolation and other kinds of things. There are also a lot of kind of industry compliance issues to take into effect as well. For certain financial transactions have to be done on premise, and various other things. But other sectors are willing to do kind of much more cloud. I think the Ontario government's a great example where you'd have to have a good reason to do anything on prem. That would never be the default. I'd actually say they're one of my favorite customers to work with. In fact, I'm not sure I
So
answered your question exactly well there, but sorry.
no, I would say it's painting a picture for me. So, the next natural question is, when you say that, for example, the Ontario government is very proactive in trying new things out, why do you think that is? So, for example, do they have people inside of the government who kind of understand these technologies, or it's because they have educated themselves, or they want to, because governments are not really open to trying a lot of new things out, or at least that's the perception.
That's the perception. I'm going to say that the drive towards doing something new, in part, is based on the fact that there are some very smart people with very kind of forward thinking within the organization, and luckily, at least the ones I've wanted to work with are enablers for the others to do good things. You need someone, in a point of control or in a decision process who wants to drive the industry forward. I think too that doing things the old way is so painful and absolutely tiresome for everybody that they're trying to escape the shackles of the ways in which they've done things before. I mean, even a simple thing like, hey, I want to build a website, and it has a database, and that kind of thing. So standard traditional database driven web app. In Azure, we can go clickety clickety click, and of course they've got nice DevOps scripts for doing infrastructure as code and all that kind of stuff. They've got that fairly well nailed. They know how they want to do authentication. They know how they want to do access controls, RBAC policies, separation, layering, firewalling. So for them, it's a clickety click. But if they were to turn around and try to do something like that on prem, it would be
Right.
a 9-month procurement process. So the legacy has become so bad that the only escape route in many cases is the cloud and actually doing things the new way. And once somebody gets a taste of it, they never want to let go of this new way of doing things. Whether it's Azure or AWS or Google, the fact that we can provision infrastructure, we can adjust that, we can do those changes through some of the CI/CD processes is just it's like a rebirth of IT being valuable as opposed to a massive lead weight for the organization. So can't speak for every organization like that, but the ones I work with, yeah.
And you have worked with legacy systems, and you are very well versed with the what's coming right now. And as a solution architect, from what I understand, is that you need to have width of knowledge along with the breadth. So is that like a conscious thing that you think about, or you should think about before, as to how wide you want to go or how deep you want to go on a particular stack or a technology?
Well, I'm an old guy, and as an old guy, I probably have a number of biases that will become clear at some point in this conversation. But a few things I will say right off the bat is you often don't get to pick the area that you want to focus on. Often it's driven by some other, at least in my line of work, because I'm a consultant and I'm doing work for others. There's a natural scope in that it's got something to do with Azure and Microsoft. Otherwise, they wouldn't bring in a Microsoft consultant to do the work. But I often don't think people get to pick the technologies that they want to focus on. To some degree, those selections, what you're learning is sort of driven based on what you're required to do. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably the case. You ideally you get some point to influence over time. But if you're starting something new, often you haven't perhaps earned that right to necessarily pick the technology you want. I think, though, that the part I miss most when chatting, particularly to young programmers, is when I started, the solution stack was about this big. I could control everything from, I'm not a mainframe guy, but started life kind of on the PC side, or VIC-20s and C64s and that back in the day. That was a fairly small stack. It was a standalone computer with a hard drive or a disk drive. And you'd learn to program in machine code or BASIC or what have you in other languages. But when you look at the size of the stack now that you're required to learn, to really see the whole system in its entirety, it's impossible. And so people pick their layers. in their stack. So you kind of I kind of don't want people to pick a technology necessarily, but perhaps pick a layer or a layer or two. Where you want that focus. The other thing too is that I always worry slightly that because we're moving so quickly in terms of changes to the technologies and the platform, and there's a new framework for doing UI pretty much every second of every day. That's the best, and we'll rule them all. I worry that people don't get a chance to invest the time it takes to learn their tools.
Right.
If you look at other industries like a carpenter or machinist, like they spend a lot of time understanding how their tools work, so that they can produce the best version of their outcome, of their outputs, their products. And I worry that so much of what we do, our tool chain appears to me a bit more as like an old timer view, is are discarded too quickly, and so that creates complexity and technical debt that much quicker. And so that's the part that I worry more about. I think I'm still of the ilk that you should probably invest in your tool chain and your tool set and kind of get good at the tools that you've decided you'd like to focus on, and then let your career kind of guide how you drift from one tool chain to another chain over time, because you kind of need to know a lot about your tools. A Visual Studio has like 100 billion features in it. Obviously, I've made that number up, but people probably use 10 things. And there's a lot that can be offered. So frameworks and tool chains and this high turnover rate is my biggest concern for anyone trying to direct their learning.
Right.
So I'm going to learn this, I'm going to learn this, and then I'm going to learn this. By the time you got to that, it's gone. And there's two new ways of doing it. So I sort of worry, how much forward planning can you really do? Like, I'm pretty sure I can plan for the next 2-3 weeks, but beyond that, I'm not too sure. I'm giving you an extreme answer, but yeah.
No, I would say I feel the same. You try a new tool out, you build something with it, and then you go online, you go on some developer community, and they are using the exactly same thing using 3, 4, 5 different tools. Yeah.
For me, selfishly, again, I'm an old time programmer. I started .NET when it was still a beta product, when it was called Next Generation Windows Services back in the day. And I loved .NET, and I'm an old C++ programmer before that. And I did some Delphi, so I recognize the lineage. And I'm so pleased today that I can write .NET code that is modern, that does everything, all the new scenarios. And now I can write full stack apps in the browser and on every mobile device. So I write all the stuff in Maui Blazor. I use web. I use some of the WebAssembly stuff with .NET Blazor, and I can just write in one language with one tool anywhere I want in the entire stack. And I feel that's a luxury that many other tool chains maybe can't provide at this point. So, but then I'm a selfish, biased Microsoft guy. So
I think you mentioned something about technical debt.
yes.
When I hear that word, it brings a lot of, I would not say pain, but it's almost pain. So could you share your experience with tech debt, and what is it, and how do you think about that, and is
Yeah.
it something that managers or programmers should plan in the beginning and not really towards the end?
It is. I spend a lot of time with customers who have many legacy systems, a lot of technical debt, old applications, unsupported tool chains as well. I can't tell you how many Visual Basic 6.0 applications still exist out there doing critical work, and Microsoft hasn't supported them for years. And so, how on earth they support themselves is beyond me. It turns out that they don't. By the way, they don't do a good job of supporting themselves either. So there's technical debt everywhere. And so on the architecture side, we always try to pick solutions and to some degree guesswork as well. You're trying to read the tea leaves to figure out, is the component that I choose to integrate in my system, or the technologies that I choose to build it with, or the platform that I choose to run it on, what is the lineage of those things? And will they exist in their current state 5 years from now? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's no. But then you kind of need to think a lot longer. Solutions don't last 5 years, they last 25. 35 years, depending on the nature of what you're doing. And so historically, because systems were built as monolithic architectures with monolithic teams, often there was never the organizational awareness that these things need to be maintained and kept. Nowadays we do CI/CD, we do continuous deployment. We have kind of a whole new way in which we approach solutions. So we're always incrementally improving them. But a lot of these systems were designed with a technology that no, it's done, and then it's done, and it stays like that for 20 years untouched. And that debt, that's an enormous amount of debt for an organization to take, because now when they want to move it to Azure, or they want to move it to AWS, or they want to move it or modernize it, nobody knows how it works. The documentation is stale. The tool chain doesn't exist. And lots of organizations are faced with, do I rebuild it, re-architect it, replace it, throw it away? And this technical debt is a huge, huge problem in the industry. And everyone's looking for some kind of, easy button to press. Like, hey, it's written in .NET. Can't you make an old-fashioned WinForms app run on the web? I mean, turns out you kind of can to some degree now, but it is the huge challenge. In fact, I would say that the majority of the work that needs to happen is on that technical debt front. People probably need less new systems and need to focus more on their technical debt to actually enable those systems to provide better APIs, better capabilities, maybe enabled through Copilot to actually get value out of some of those old systems. But that requires a lot of engineering work, and there's still a huge fear in touching code. As a software developer, I'm so comfortable making changes in code. It's like, oh, finally, I can just correct and do it right. But for most people who don't understand it, I think there's like, oh, we don't want to touch the code because something might break. Yeah, but something might work better. And so this debt is a huge, huge problem. And I think maybe my last point on technical debt is often the technical debt itself within an organization falls on the IT and operations team, not on the business, and not on perhaps the innovation team. So some guy who's used to resetting passwords and deploying Windows or Linux all of a sudden has this technical debt that he has to deal with. But it's sort of it's not really his problem. It's a system problem. It's a programmer's problem, but that group doesn't exist anymore. So it's the wrong person trying to solve the problem through perhaps, well, I'll virtualize it. Somehow that'll make it better. Or I'll containerize it. Somehow that'll make it better. It turns out none of that makes any difference whatsoever. It just adds another layer of complexity. But these are the kind of the solutions that you take when you're not the person that's capable of perhaps re-engineering or re-architecting that system, or given the budget or the talent to do that kind of work. So yeah, technical, that's a massive organizational problem. And we need to make sure that when we design a new system, we always think about how many of these things will exist in 5 years, and maybe I'm best not to pick the best, newest, shiny object.
Right.
And sometimes I don't want to pick on open source, but in the open source world, if something doesn't do what you want, then they fork it and they make another version, and they call that the new one, and then that the new one. Instead of fixing the core thing, or actually really finessing the original one, they tend to be a proliferation of these little things, that go off on their own little wild ways. Whereas with an organization, I'll pick on Microsoft as an example, there tends to be, no, we're going to kind of fix and re-engineer, and we're going to make sure we have compatibility and these kinds of things. Just my opinion anyway.
I would say what you are sharing is more like a technical perspective. And when you are working with, let's say, the public sector right now, I am assuming that you are having this exact discussion many, many times with the stakeholders who are trying to update the systems or maintain the systems or modernize them. So how can we, as for example, technical people, encourage or educate the stakeholders, the decision makers who might not necessarily be technical, to understand technical debt and start prioritizing it? Like you mentioned that you cannot imagine how many systems still are operating on very old systems. That to me is makes me anxious, if you know what I'm saying. Like things can break anytime, kind of a thing. So how can we even start that discussion with them?
I'm going to start by saying I don't know, because I don't have the secret sauce yet to know how to get an executive to understand the risk that they carry. They know they carry the risk, and maybe it's a human being problem, but it is interesting. There's so many legacy systems out there. It's often it's often disaster that actually convinces people that now they have to do something. So even though all the signs are there, and I can do, Microsoft often does assessments, portfolio assessments, and we figure out all the good, the bad, the ugly about systems. So all the information is often known. But executives often need that compelling event in order to trigger prioritization and budget in order to actually address the problem. So they're often faced with, I don't know what to do, and some people say this and some people say that. And while people dither about what they should do, it almost like gives that executive an excuse to just kick the problem down the line. It usually ends up being, as much as I hate to say it, it's usually disaster, whether it's a security breach, it's an infrastructure failure. I work with customers who are still running on old Sun hardware, where they literally cannot replace the computer parts because they don't exist anymore. And yet, some of them, because there's no disaster,
Yet.
they kind of refuse to move. But I kind of wish there was some. I think people in business, particularly management, I don't want to use the word coward, but they're not
Right.
brave. So somewhere in the middle there, right? They're not brave and bold enough in their ambition. And it's a shame because the executives that I see that have moved through the ranks of an organization, a particularly large enterprise, I'll pick on banking where there's lots of good places to move. It's the bold ones that built the system that provided, took a system that provided a value unit of 5 to now provide a value unit of 10 and took the risk and built that system. And now it does 10 times more than it did before. They're the ones that are seen as the leaders in an organization, as opposed to perhaps the middle managers within an organization who are kind of trying to wash things under the carpet. So I think there's maybe perhaps a need to find ambitious people within an organization. As I said, I think it's a human problem because all the evidence and the assessments tell you need to do something, and there's usually 2 or 3 good recommendations. It's that need to act that's often missing. And at Microsoft, often we see it's a licensing issue that might drive that. That's the compelling event. Perhaps there's a renewal, or you can't run Windows 2003 still because there's no security updates for it unless you pay us a large amount of money, or that kind of thing, which is almost our way of saying, please, please, please upgrade. So I think it's a compelling event that's you need to find, or at least be able to create scenarios around compelling events that executive does not want to endure for their career, as a way in which you make that motion happen. I don't think it's a technical problem, though, at least not from my perspective.
Does it kind of mean that the system that most organizations are set up in does not really have the incentive to prioritize this? Apart from definitely the human problem, like there is no incentive to go out there and change these things, because even if I change it, all the people who are involved in the decision, they won't be incentivized for it, they won't be applauded for it, they won't be paid for it, for example.
I think that's true. I think almost all organizations I work with all have people dedicated to focusing on technical debt. I think they've all done a good job of prioritizing what should be fixed and perhaps even how. Like I'm constantly presented with from enterprise architects, for example, big Excel spreadsheets full of every horrible system that they have, and the nth degree of detail from their CMDB or their ServiceNow about all the horrific information that's there. So there's visibility to it. There's prioritization. I've often read roadmap decks. I can't tell you how many roadmap decks I've seen where this is version 4 of the roadmap, and version 2 and version 3 I have a copy of from a meeting I had with them 4 years ago, and it's the same thing. So it's this inability to act, but that's a prioritization at the kind of executive level. And I guess most executives, maybe they're cowards, maybe they're just I think in reality they're there to run the business, they're not there to run IT systems. And the decision to do something really should be a business led decision. Like, what does the system do for me? What doesn't it do that I should be doing? I need a system that does X. Like, lead forward to make sure the system provides more value, not just a platform replacement. I think there's got to be incentive. There's got to be something tangible for the business. Otherwise, these systems will just continue to rot.
Do you feel that's because most of the businesses existed and then they eventually became IT enabled, but they were not IT first from day one? And hence, the culture that is kind of set in this organization, they don't see IT as the value advantage, but they kind of
Correct.
see
Oh,
it as
definitely.
the enabler.
Yeah, I would agree with your point 100%. There are some organizations where I do see that shift. Um, I think with the advent of things like online banking or any kind of online aspect to the business, it was really the first chance for IT to demonstrate and kind of get in front of the end users in systems and therefore to be seen as perhaps providing value. But historically, your comments are 100% right. IT is seen as a cost. Like nothing good comes out of IT. And every time you want them to say something, they say no or they want money. Um, but often they're not tied to the hip, from an innovation perspective. Now, every organization has some department of what was a popular word a few years ago, digital transformation. So they have a digital transformation lead in organization that used to scurry around to try to find old systems or new ideas and do proof of concepts and as wonderful as some of that work was, and I participated in a good chunk of that work. Um, Often their approach didn't was almost incompatible with 90% of the rest of the organization. And it was difficult to, the term I like to use is cross the chasm between, some guy that's built this amazing proof of concept that demonstrates clear business value, but because he did it with some crazy technologies and did it in a way to bankify it, for example, that chasm crossing is 2 to 3 years. And the business would say, I don't understand why.
So there is a huge opportunity basically to fill this gap, or it's an impossible dream.
Getting back to AI and copilots, if there was a way to reduce the chasm between idea and implementation,
Right.
the more we can close that chasm, then the more success we would see in good ideas, you know, coming to fruition. And if for things like low code solutions, like things like Power Apps and what have you, kind of, I'm going to say, sort of flirt with the idea that you could get something that's a prototype to be the thing that's kind of production with less of an IT uplift. And I think there's a certain amount of promise and hope, and maybe there's reality as well. But those, if we could somehow reduce that chasm from being 2 to 3 years to maybe being 2 to 3 months, and also the idea in business that we want to deliver incremental value, and that's a hard thing for most organizations because they say, well, I have my requirements list. You have to have 500 requirements. Well, then it'll be 5 years. Could you really get it down to 10 requirements? And the answer is usually they can't. So we have all these wonderful ways of building agile solutions and doing things agile. That's all based on this idea of user stories and incremental features. But no organization accepts that as the output model. They said, no, you have to have all 100 features. You can't ship the product until 100 features are there. So we're so good at doing 30 features and then refining, but yet we're incompatible with the way people want the output. So yeah, agile delivery in a waterfall framework is kind of what we end up with, unfortunately. So
That is, I would say, that is a bit surprising to me. For some reason, my perception was that if an organization is working with Microsoft, which is the biggest of the biggest companies on the planet, they would listen to them. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if I'm hiring Microsoft to do something, I'll listen to what they're saying.
yep. And usually that's true when it comes to the how it should be done, but when it comes to the what it should do, I mean, if you look at, for example, a system that's going to do something simple, you might be able to describe the user stories, just the scenarios of the application, the feature set, as it needs to do these three things.
Right.
But then you look at the list of non functional requirements, which are mandatory requirements. you realize that actually the 5 features are the simple thing. The 90% of the work is in the non-functionals that are all requirements. They need to think about, support models. They need to think about kind of escalations. They need to think about deployment models. They want to think about, security to the nth degree. Well, I mean, security is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. But there's so much that goes into building a solution that has very little to do with the lines of code and the work that the development team actually does, that in many ways they're the very small part relative to the organization that needs to adopt and deploy. Even making a change to a system that might be very simple to make, easy to deploy, they might need 6 weeks of discussion with the communications team on how they're going to roll out training changes so that they can retrain some of the frontline staff because you moved a button from there to there. I mean, I'm making an exaggeration, obviously, but so the 2 days it took you to write the lines of code is just noise. It doesn't matter if you deployed it with CI/CD and you did all that stuff. The chain of other things that sort of stretch out beyond how the system actually works, those things only work at certain things. That's where we need agile, actually. It's more on the outer shell.
Is it like, for example, your responsibility to also calculate all of that when you are getting started as a solution architect, like starting a project? I mean, like, do you have to calculate all of this before you give a get go to a project?
I don't know that I would use the word calculate, but I need to be very much aware of the impact that that's going to have on the schedule. We often say, it'll take me 2 months to write it, but it'll take you 6 months to receive it. So if I'm calculating just from a pure resourcing perspective, sure, I can build it in 2 months, no problem. If you get out of the way, 2 months, no problem. But in reality, I need to work within the organization because each one of those other things and groups and training and support, they all play valuable roles.
Right.
So, but I need to know that from a resourcing perspective, even though I can build it in 2 months, I won't be able to. I won't be, I'll have too many stops and starts. I also know that I can't just go in and do it and then walk away. I need to make sure that a portion of the team is there for the correct adoption, understanding and listening to feedback. So when we do kind of the calculation, I need to think about the speed at which the organization can receive it almost more than the effort required to build it. The effort to build it is always, let's say, argument's sake, 30% of the project.
Wow.
70% of the project is other stuff.
So does that involve like assessing the company, like talking to the stakeholders, asking them questions, what they use currently, what kind of people they are employing, things like that?
Yeah, we often do like a sprint zero to do some of those things, but quite often because Microsoft has many long-term relationships with big organizations, we're often fairly aware of the corporate culture prior to starting the project. Many of us have also done kind of several projects in banking, if not even in the same company. We also have the fortune in some cases to have people that have been working perhaps inside a team, the operations team or the Azure cloud team for kind of years on end. And so we often have very good insights into how things are done. And that's reciprocated. The customer has good insights into how Microsoft does things as well, right? So we're kind of benefiting from that kind of shared context. With a startup, like I could build an app in probably a few weeks. We'd be out, done, click, 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 away we go. But you can't do that in a bank, and nor should you, right? I mean, there are too many important things on the line. They have a brand to protect. They've got security. They've got customer service. When people phone up the bank and somebody says, "I don't know what you're talking about," that's not an acceptable answer. They need to know everything and have insights and customer 360s and all these things. These matters. That's why that non-functional requirements list in many enterprises is 1,000 things for the 5 things that the app does. So
Did you
if you can find a good way to escape it, I'm all ears on if we can find a way to solve that problem. But I think that's kind of the reality.
do you think you understood all of this when you got started, the 30/70 split? And when you did actually understand it, was that a bit surprising for you? It's surprising to me, I would say.
Yeah. it surprised me over my career at Microsoft.
Right.
In hindsight, I should have been smarter, but it became very apparent early on.
Right.
I did have the good fortune that when I joined Microsoft back in 1998, it was the dot com hype. So I spent most of my time building many of the the big retailers here in Canada, bringing them online for the first time. It was a fabulous opportunity to do that with many of the big names that are here now that still exist. But that was a luxury to some degree to work with teams that were competing against Amazon, which at that time was a bookstore, and competing with various other retailers or groceries and other things. The scale of innovation and the pace was there, so it was exciting, and there was a level of risk that these organizations were all willing to take, because the risk was that somebody else was going to eat your lunch unless you could kind of get in the market as fast as possible. But then as time went by, um, there were bruises from some of that work that we did in the online space. We would do something online that they kind of didn't have the perhaps the back end capability to fulfill particularly well, and so we caused some bruising along the way. And I started to build perhaps more awareness that my solution fits in the scope of a much larger context that I need to be aware of. And that learning, I wish I'd learned that slightly faster, to be honest. But I sort of stumbled my way through as a young lad, working at Microsoft. I started Microsoft in my 20s, and kind of learning these things. So it was surprising, but it probably shouldn't have been.
Well, I would say we had 1 hour, and this has been quite something. I really, it was fun. It was very nice.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about containerization. But yeah, I've enjoyed the process. Thank you for letting me attend the podcast and be a speaker on it. It was very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your time, sir. How do you think was how we went about it?
Interesting. I didn't quite know what to expect, but I had watched one or two of your other podcasts to kind of get the nature of it, just more familiarity. So that was super helpful. Yeah, and yeah, it wasn't quite. You're actually my very first podcast I think I've ever done. I don't think I've ever done a podcast before, but I spent a career doing presentations in front of audiences and things like that, but not never a podcast. So thank you very much for being the first and making it such an enjoyable process.
We can also do a few more, in the months to come. We would love to. So, like
Yeah,
I would say for every episode, I don't have a precise list of questions in mind. I would
yeah,
say I have themes and concepts which I like to cover, but there is no
yeah.
agenda or like a very precise way to get there, because I cannot decide that. You mentioned that 70% is how the other organization responds.
Yeah.
I would say 30% I kind of have in mind, but I would say your ideation and your story guide the process.
Okay, excellent. And those are not accurate numbers. I mean, obviously, it's used as an example, but absolutely, it is fascinating. I mean, there's so much in our industry to learn, and when you're a programmer, and then become perhaps a developer, and then become an architect, and then start to really think more about you're serving the business, and so you really start to think about their context, and because you're familiar with the technology, that no longer becomes your concern. So you start to think more and more broadly with each successive project, and you build a kind of I'm going to call it like a checklist. So all the things that that they're going to ask about that they haven't. So when I talk to a customer, I do talk about the support model, and I do talk about operations and security, and all these things are like, almost less talk about what the solution even does, assuming that, it's reasonably well understand what it's going to do. But yeah, there are just so many other things that are kind of important to bring to the surface. Um, the thing I always worry about is people building a solution don't have a shared vision. So somebody has an idea of what it should be, and another person has another idea and another idea, and they may not even realize that their ideas don't line up. And so that shared vision portion is kind of critical. So I spend most of my time, I would say, building a shared vision, and mutating that vision, based on new things. So that's an important part: communication and sharing ideas. There's a good book called The Mythical Man Month. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's an old-fashioned book.
Mythical man.
It's called The Mythical Man Month,
Okay, mythical
and
man
it was
month.
written
Okay.
by an engineer at IBM. The idea that people used to think about labor in terms of man months of effort. So you could have 10 months worth of work, or you could just have 10 people, and then you could do it in 1 month. And perhaps that's true for digging a trench. But in complex, high context systems, that actually doesn't work. All of a sudden, if you have 10 people, it now takes 2 years to do it. So it actually takes longer the more people you add. So I often spend time trying to make sure that my team size is very small. In fact, it's even better when I have to get something done faster to reduce the team size even more if possible. Because the idea was that the communication lines between everybody increases exponentially every time you add someone into the loop. So if you want to make a decision, you should have 5 people in your meeting or 3 people in your meeting, not 25.
And you
So
you shared that, or I would say over the last 1 hour, what you shared, from what I understood, were realizations that you have had over the years. That's how I would frame it.
yeah, yeah.
And did you realize this ideas or notions consciously? Like, do you have a process for that now, where you sit down and kind of try to retrospect over what has been, and try to derive, I would say, insights and lessons that guide you forward? Is that like a conscious effort in that direction for you?
I'm going to say it's probably a twofold. I would say a lot of it is subconscious, but when Microsoft puts together even something as simple as a statement of work, we have a template for a statement of work. We have kind of, if we're trying to do a particular kind of deployment, particularly, let's say we're going to do a Dynamics project. There's a whole series of checklists and templates and questionnaires. Like there's a lot of internal intellectual property around things we should do, things we should ask, and things we need to determine in a sequence and order. So a lot of what we do, you could say, has been templatized. And I would say that was true for other partners like Accenture and Avanade and IBM. I mean, they have this sort of structured approach, and then people borrow that and then have the conversation and maybe add 2 or 3 other things that are more relevant, or skip over parts that perhaps less relevant for each customer. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk about other things in the future as well. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, do you have any departing thoughts that you'd like to share? How was the experience? What did you think about the questions?
No, it was very good actually. Yeah, I didn't really have a whole lot of. I wasn't sure about how much we might talk about AI or the journey or other things. So yeah, I mean, I'm a guy who likes to talk about things, and I'm full of opinions and biases. So happy to share them. I can have a conversation pretty much about everything, even things I don't know. I can have a conversation about, because I love to learn things and appreciate learning things on a regular basis. So yeah, but no, it was very good. Thank you so much. Thank you for being such a good host.